Well, thank you. Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Michèle, for having me. It's a great pleasure. And this is an absolutely exciting lineup here. So it's an honor also to join you here this morning. I guess what I'm going to do now is add a bit of a big picture talk on what it is that that the EU's decarbonization pathway means in terms of external energy policy, but also geopolitics. And you've touched upon this morning already, but I guess it's worth reminding us that at the very end, what we're looking at is a mega project, the EU Green Deal, and with it, the broader idea of going low carbon is something that amounts to essentially a second wave of industrialization. So we do away with the old model, we bring a new model in. We get rid of the fossil fuel stuff, we bring in renewables, but with it, we turn an entire economy on its head. Because this is not only about putting a few solar cells on our rooftops. It's not about importing a few green molecules in the shape of green hydrogen. What it is at the very end is we're reinventing our economic model. And I guess that's something what we need to bear in mind when talking about the external dimension of the EU Green Deal. I mean, on the face of it, that's essentially what it looks like. This is this wonderful, nice graph that the European Commission produces. It talks about everything from farm to fork, that's agriculture, to sustainable transport. But what's underpinning all of this and below the surface, at the very end, means we're changing our economic model. And that also means we're changing the economic model of a $16 trillion economy. And that's quite sizable, because whatever a $16 trillion economy does is something that has external implications. So we better start thinking about this. The way I would like you to think about this, and maybe that's where we go a little bit into further detail, is by way of looking at the energy mix. So there's essentially two steps that we need to bear in mind here when it comes to the EU energy mix going forward. And kindly, the European Commission has done a few numbers for us. So this is what I'm reporting here. If you look at the change that will happen from 2015 through 2030, so this decade, you see a bit of a change, and that change pertains to renewables becoming a little bit stronger. But it isn't that much of a change. Natural gas still is in the mix. It actually reclaims an equal share in 2030 as it does today. Oil is becoming a little bit less prominent, but it remains in the mix. What really changes is coal. So essentially what renewables do is they eat into coal. And they do this for various reasons, including policy measures. The ETS plays a role, sectoral changes play a role, but also because of the increased competitiveness of solar, wind, and other renewables. Now, the big change here really is the moment you look up to 2050. That's the way we go carbon neutral. So between 2030 and 2050, there is two massive changes. One is oil is on the way out. There's a little bit of oil that's kept in the mix. It's going to be decarbonized more or less, and gas is on the way out as well. So essentially what we're looking at is roughly a fourth of today's gas needs in 2030. By contrast, you got a few other things coming in. One obviously is renewables, but second, you have e-fuels coming in that essentially are at the center of our discussion today and tomorrow, and that's what Andreas has also talked about. And they're important because they will populate the hard to decarbonize sectors. I mean, think about aluminum, think about steel, think about air traffic, air freight, heavy duty EV vehicles, these kind of things. I don't think they're going to play any role in mobility, but particularly in hard to decarbonize sectors where you don't have a lot of alternatives, this is where they're going to play a role. And that's the massive change pertaining to the energy mix. Now, going a little bit more into the question of what does this mean for the external dimension of the EU, I guess there's three things. And that's where I want to go into detail. The first is probably want to think a little bit about trade. Because at the very end, if you turn a $16 trillion economy upside down, what it means is you decarbonize internally, you force your industry to switch from a non-sustainable to a sustainable model, but it also means you increase costs for them. And that gives them an incentive to shift some of the production abroad. With it, carbon dioxide emissions would go abroad, and they go to places that have less stringent decarbonization pathways. So places that don't put a premium on decarbonizing quickly and don't have policies in place like a carbon pricing system or other things. We call this carbon leakage. So the whole idea of carbon leakage is essentially, some industry shifts abroad, manufacturing or other, and we essentially, through the backdoor, start importing the dirty stuff that's produced elsewhere, whilst deindustrializing internally. That's precisely why a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as Andreas just talked about, is being discussed at the moment. So essentially, the big point here is, how do you level the playing field for this? So that, going low carbon doesn't necessarily mean you decarbonize. The external dimension of this is, well, you probably got to start thinking about taxing carbon at the border. So in order to level the playing field between companies abroad and companies producing at home, there needs to be some mechanism of accounting for the carbon footprint of that production. That's the first bit I want to talk about. The second thing is, well, there probably is something to be said about security, because going low carbon doesn't necessarily only mean that we're importing less stuff in terms of fossil fuels, oil and gas, but it also means that the ones that export that stuff to us face a shrinking market and arguably a soft market going forward. Now, you can say, well, tough choices, they're a problem, but at the very end, there's a lot more to it, because some of the states that we're looking at don't necessarily have grand alternatives when it comes to export products, because they have one source of revenue, and that's oil, some a little bit gas, but most of them is oil. So the question really is, that's the second question I want to talk about, which are the ones that we need to worry about, and what can the EU do about that? And the third is, tying a little bit more into the theme of today and tomorrow, what does all of this mean for energy diplomacy? I mean, at the very end, if we want to bring clean liquids in, that means hydrogen, green hydrogen, but also other power-to-X technologies. Then the question is, where does this come from? We won't produce that stuff at home. We need to get it from somewhere, if it is scaled up the way the European Commission foresees it is scaled up. And that essentially begs a very important question, is whom do we reach out to? What does that mean for foreign policy priorities? So let's go a little bit into this. Trade. So the big question, I guess, that we're seeing coming up the moment we start taxing carbon at the border is, can the countries exporting to the EU adjust? Because countries exporting to the EU have essentially taken a choice, which is they trade with the EU. So the moment you tax their imports at the border, or their exports to the EU at the border, the question really is there a way for them to adjust to that tax, or do they simply become uncompetitive? And that boils down essentially to a design question. So the question really is, how do you design such a carbon border tax, or a carbon border adjustment mechanism, as it is called in EU language? For the sake of the argument, you can think about it in two ways. You can say, look, we tax everything, or we just tax the carbon heavy stuff. We call this EITE sectors, the energy intensive sectors. And so what I'm presenting here is numbers that my team at the IASS crunched, and which is also out as a policy brief. Essentially, what they asked is, what is it that you do depending on what you get, depending on those two design options, and the questions that pertain to how countries can adapt, or whether they can adapt in the first place, is exposure. do they have options? Can they trade with someone else if the EU becomes closed for their products? And second, how vulnerable are they? Can they adapt? And here the question is not only whether they can decarbonize quickly enough, which is precisely the idea of the EU. The EU says, look, if you want to export to us, then, well, you can do that, but you have to decarbonize your production so that you become a little bit more like us and help us save the planet. But the question really is, can those countries? Are they quick enough? Do they have access to finance, technology, on all the things that you need? Plus, if they decarbonize quickly enough, can they actually report? Can they prove that their products have a low carbon content? And that boils down to things like measurement, quality infrastructure, and these kind of things. And if you throw these things together, you get a country risk index. And that's what our team did. And essentially, it looks like this. So if you throw all these things at countries, you start measuring their capacity to adapt. You look at their emission trajectories, the investments trajectories when it comes to low carbon technology. You look at all these things that I talked about: exposure, optionality, and trade. And if you say, look, we look at all imports, then what it boils down to is a bunch of, the bluer you get, or the heavy bluer you get, dark blue you get, the worse it is. It's a bunch of countries in Africa that are mostly affected, plus countries in the neighborhood of the EU, notably Northern Africa, but also, for instance, in the Balkans. And if you go further far east, it's countries like Vietnam, other Southeast Asian nations that have or are in the process of concluding free trade agreements with the EU. So essentially, what you're looking at here is a pretty uneven distribution of the policy risk of such a CBAM. It is not necessarily China that you're hurting. Let's put it differently, right? We're not talking China. We're probably not even talking Russia. What we're talking about is middle-income countries that are of not great economic size, and hence may find it difficult of attracting enough low-carbon finance in time to make the adjustment. Now, let's think about the same thing for only the carbon-intensive sectors, and the picture changes slightly, but not very much. What you get in is a lot more countries in the Balkans. Ukraine doesn't look good, precisely the countries that want to stabilize, and countries in Northern Africa. So the long and the short of it is taxing carbon at the border, in principle, an important thing because you want to prevent carbon leakage, but the devil really is in the details, because if you get it wrong, it essentially means that you deprive economies very close to home of their ability to export. And that also means you risk cutting them out of global supply and value chains. Essentially, they lose out economically for the cause of saving the climate. So there's a pretty tough trade-off that you got to bear in mind. Now, that's your trade problem. But let's think a little bit about countries that we trade with, obviously, but countries that we don't trade, goods and services with, but resource commodities, energy commodities. And here the problem is not necessarily one pertaining to a CBAM, a border carbon tax, but the problem here is more or less that they essentially by design don't have a great deal of a choice of what they export. Let's look a little bit into this. So if you ask the question of who is in for the long game in all of this, then essentially what you want to do is you want to look at the RP ratio. So if you want to ask which countries have an interest in staying in the market, even in a soft market, in a shrinking oil market going forward for a long time, then essentially I would say it's those countries. So there's countries like Venezuela at current rates, they can keep on producing for about 300 years. Countries like Iran can produce for 85 years at current rates. Saudi Arabia could produce 60 years still. So these are countries that have a very, very long time horizon. We're not necessarily talking Algeria, we're not necessarily talking Russia, right? So if we look at those countries and ask not only whether they have a long time horizon, but also whether they can sit through a shrinking and softer market, then the question becomes, at what cost do they produce? And here the picture is really different. So you have some countries that are really, really low cost. So you got Saudi Arabia for the sake of the argument. Depending on where you look, they produce at less than 10, sometimes less than $5. To put this in very simple terms, you put a straw into the sand and oil comes out. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the point is they're produced at really, really low costs. And that holds true for most of the Persian Gulf producers. The moment you look at more like a middle group here, that's Norway or Russia, their lifting costs are a little bit high, which means they need a higher oil price going forward in a shrinking and softer market. And then you got a bunch of countries like Venezuela or Nigeria and others that have comparably high oil lifting costs. So they might find it more difficult even to sit this through going forward, should Europe decarbonize, but the US as well, maybe other places going forward like China. And that gets us to a final question, which is, what else might determine their choice when it comes to what else is it that might determine whether they can cope with a shrinking and softer oil market? And that's where we get into the social price of oil. So countries don't necessarily only have lifting costs that play a role, but the question also is, what is the price of oil that they need to balance their budgets? And that's a function of things like, how big is your public sector? Do you subsidize energy costs for your local population? How big is your surveillance apparatus? How much money do you spend on military? Essentially the things that not so democratic countries like to spend money on. So at the very end, it boils down to one single question: what price is needed for those countries, mostly non-democratic countries, authoritarian regimes, to sustain the social contract? The social contract essentially in the shape of an elite ruling, pocketing the money, and the population essentially getting subsidized oil, gas, and water prices, plus job security, more or less, in return. If those countries cannot deliver anymore, the social contract breaks. And if you want to have a hunch of where the problematic cases are, essentially everything east of that. So what I plotted here is just the oil price that we have at the moment. There's something to be said about not going into the red too much for a long time going forward. So countries like Libya, Bahrain, but also Algeria, Iran, they might find it very difficult going forward to balance their budgets at an oil price that's at current levels or lower, and probably also going lower going forward because of a low carbon economy looming. And that gives us essentially a little box. If you want to think about which countries are the ones that you might want to worry about, the ones that are green, they're sitting okay. So, lifting costs relatively low, social costs moderate, manageable. What you want to worry about is the ones in red. So Venezuela, not too close. Libya, a lot closer. Nigeria, something to set of migration problems. And so these are countries that, in terms of EU external energy or external foreign policy or external energy policy, you probably want to look out for when it comes to the external effects of a big trading bloc going carbon. Quick word on Algeria. Here it is. Lifting costs are relatively low, but they have high social costs. So some of the countries, this is not a country that has a high RP ratio, but nevertheless, I would put it here and say, look, watch out for that, simply because the EU going low carbon may have destabilizing effects on their economies, and that's something that we need to take care of. A final point here, and that's where we get into most recent research that has been done at the Brand School, and I have a fantastic group of students here that work with me on this. The final question, I guess, that I want to touch upon is, if you want to beef up hydrogen imports, green hydrogen imports, that it essentially boils down to one question, which is, where do we get it from? I mean, it's not going to be a massively big market, but it's going to be a sizable market. And it's a market that we cannot satisfy from at home. Now, the one way you want to think about this is essentially by way of asking, what is it that the EU wants? And what the EU wants, essentially, and that's what they have publicly said, is, they want green hydrogen that ticks a number of boxes. First, they want that hydrogen to be sustainable. So it needs to be environmentally sustainable. It needs to be green hydrogen, but it also needs to be sustainable in terms of social impact. It needs to protect communities the moment you do that. There shouldn't be a lot of trade-offs between, do I produce hydrogen or something else? Or do I produce hydrogen for export? Or do I feed the local population and their grid with it? The second thing you want to think about is, for instance, how can I lower opportunity costs? And that's where we get into economic relations. Do I have energy partnerships, for instance? Is there free trade agreements? What is there that can make my life easier if I want to import stuff from countries? The third point, obviously, climate. The climate element here is important, and demonstration projects should be in place. We need to know something about the NDCs and green pathways and these kind of things. And finally, there should be something to be said about investment opportunity, regulatory certainty, statistical capacity, political stability, ease of doing business at the very end. So this is what the EU has said they want to think about when importing green hydrogen, and particularly when setting up partnerships. Now, we took all of this, and my student team essentially started to put numbers behind all of this, and then they weighted this in order to get a score and an index, which essentially looks like this. So if you look at countries that might have the potential to export hydrogen going forward, then everything on the left is essentially in line with the EU criteria, more or less. So the higher the bars, the more you take the boxes, and on the right, you're not. So I hope you can read that, but if essentially the gold standard, if you want, is Norway on the left side. So there's Australia, Canada, the US, New Zealand, Ireland, and Iceland, and others. And then on the right side, you got places like Kenya, Ethiopia, Iran, Argentina, Ukraine, Saudi Arabia, and so on and so forth. Now, if you look at this only from a political point of view, you would say, look, let's take everyone on the left, everyone who's West here, and let's try and build partnerships with them. But then there's another criterion coming into this. And the moment you start plotting costs against this, the picture starts to change, because the only one that has low import costs, according to most models that we found, is Norway. And that's a function of them being close to home. The other ones that are low cost are essentially on the other side of the equator here, which is, you can look at, I don't know, places like Kazakhstan, Algeria, Egypt, or other places. They have relatively low import costs, but don't necessarily look very good when it comes to political criteria. And the moment you add high import costs, essentially most of your politically kind of desirable candidates are out. So what this means is essentially tough trade-offs when it comes to your hydrogen partnerships. Now, let me summarize all of this, because I'm probably out of my time already. I guess there's a couple of things that we need to think about when it comes to the external implications of the EU Green Deal and of going low carbon. One is economic power. And again, let me just drive this home. The moment a $16 trillion economy goes low carbon, it has external effects. We better think about this before something goes wrong. And which means we need to consider vulnerable exporters and CBAM policy design. We need to think about security issues. That's more about hedging for unintended side effects, notably in the neighborhood. And we need to think about whom we prioritize in terms of regional stability. There's something to be said about Algeria and Northern Africa, but maybe that goes beyond and stretches all the way into Central Africa. I think there is an imperative coming out of what I said, for development policy to play a much, much stronger role. We need to make non-EU countries part of the Green Deal, otherwise it won't work. I'm convinced about that. If you can't insulate the EU and pretend that everything we're doing is for the climate and the climate only, and everything else doesn't matter. So it essentially means giving those countries that are not part of the EU, but that will be affected, an opportunity to decarbonize and to decarbonize quickly. That means partnerships, tech partnerships, tech transfer. We need to think about funds. There's a big discussion around CBAM at the moment, aiming at feeding EU coffers. As far as I'm concerned, this should not happen. Should be money that's funneled back to those countries. Why should they pay for us going low carbon? And finally, I think there's something to be said going back to the EU literature, normative power. I mean, let's set standards. Let's use the attractive market that we have to not only scale up hydrogen elsewhere, but do it in a green way so that's sustainable and helps fighting climate change. So with that, I guess I'd like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I will now pass the floor to Philipp, who is ready with the second contribution, and we will have the discussion once all participants have introduced their takes on the issue. Philipp?
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for inviting me, and also, yeah, hello to everyone in the panel and in the audience. It's really nice to be invited here and to give a few to make a few points. Thanks also, Andreas, for kind of setting the scene. I will now look a little bit more into what the European Commission has been doing in external energy governance. So I will be more a EU focus and the governance focus. And in a few minutes I will use for my opening intervention, I will speak mainly about EU external energy governance as a very gradual development overall, and that is closely interlinked with the development of EU governance authority on the internal energy market. And here my intervention is structured along two parts. I will make first a few statements on the development of the internal energy market and how this is promoted, and then how this has promoted some aspects of EU external energy policy. And then I will go a little bit more in detail and put the spotlight specifically on some aspects of EU external energy diplomacy and show how it barely existed for quite a long time, this kind of diplomatic I will define that, this diplomatic element, and how in about the last 10 years, the Commission has gained quite some increasing governance competence in this field. I do not have a slides, but Jan told me that this will be recorded, and so you can have always a look at it again if that's correct. So the integration of European external energy, European energy policy in general has accelerated immensely since the 1990s, and the Commission has been always a key actor in driving this development, even though it had for a long time no formal powers in the energy sector. And it used a specific approach to act in the field, and that's basically it argued that the completion of the EU internal energy market, or an EU internal energy market, is vital for the completion of the EU's internal market in general. So it based its legislative initiatives in the energy field on competences it had in the internal market domain, in the competition field, and also to a lesser extent in the environmental domain. And overall, it appears that the Commission has been quite successful in pushing this approach, because it has gradually acquired ever more policy-making competences and managed to build up an EU energy policy. So, and there are quite a few examples on this, as these successive energy packages to liberalize the European gas and electricity markets. Eventually in 2009, we then had a treaty chapter on energy included in the Lisbon Treaty, and Article 194 of the treaty functioning on the European Union. And then from then on, you probably know that there has been quite some Commission activism in the energy field, which obviously culminated in Juncker's Energy Union and the Clean Energy Package, and then as well now as the European Green Deal. And Andreas focused on that and pointed that out quite a bit. Having that said, these integration dynamics I described are all related to the internal energy market. And my argument now is that whereas the Commission has been quite successful in centralizing governance authority in internal energy market issues, a common European approach to external energy does not really exist. this statement needs a little bit of qualification, because we do see some external energy policy in areas where which are intrinsically related to the promotion and to the safeguarding of the functioning of the internal energy market. So few examples here in this respect. So for instance, the externalization of the energy acquis to the neighborhood and partners in exchange for market access. So for instance, the European Economic Area or the energy community. We've talked, I think you've talked with that, Andres Spielwald talked about this before. Then there's defending the defense of EU energy market principles vis-a-vis external actors wishing to operate on the EU market, for instance, Russia or the famous Gazprom cases. There's also been the promotion of domestic energy security to ensure the functioning of the internal energy market, and the Commission has been doing so through legislation, for instance, the Security of Supply Directive, through an agenda to diversify routes and sources of supply. This refers to new pipeline projects, but also LNG terminals, the promotion of renewable energy sources, North Sea offshore grid, etc. And then also bilateral talks. So for instance, energy dialogues and EU-Russia, Ukraine gas talks. All of these elements have caused some scholars, Andreas Goldthau has been among them, to call the EU a liberal actor in external energy affairs. But EU external energy policy does not exist or barely exist with regard to a common European energy diplomacy. I primarily look now for a few minutes until the time of around 2010. After this, this statement needs a bit more qualification because there have been some changes. The reasons why the EU has not very easily integrated in EU energy diplomacy have been, on the one hand, structural. The EU member states differ significantly on their energy mixes, and of course that brings in different interests with regard to energy supplies. And then also, obviously, most states regard energy as vital for economic and societal development, and thus an area of high politics, which is closely related to questions of security and national sovereignty. And so consequently, they have often rejected any calls for transferring competences to the supranational level. Now, generally, this also here needs a little asterisk, because some states have been willing to integrate on these areas in energy diplomacy, where concerted action really helped them to shape the general sort of external context or conditions in a way that make them specifically more conducive to achieving their own individual national energy objectives. And an example here are the Eastern European or Central and Eastern European member states with a strong oil and gas dependence on Russia, which have been always more vocal about a common European approach to energy. But they have not been very successful. If you look at the history of the Energy Union, for instance, originally the plan that Donald Tusk once made when he was Polish Prime Minister, when he promoted something like an energy union, he had in mind a very external energy, strong external energy dimension in this energy union. Juncker's energy union, then, which in the end was flying. Well, does not have so much this external element. But let's go back to energy diplomacy here. We see almost no supranational competencies for a long time. And we can see that also in this Article 194 of the which brings an energy chapter into the Lisbon Treaty. The second paragraph there specifies that EU member states have the right to decide about their energy mix and supply structure. And this means basically that they remain competent to conclude international agreements with suppliers, and they cannot be preempted by EU internal action from doing so. So national preferences have long continued to dominate EU energy diplomacy, and joint action always then depended obviously on intergovernmental cooperation. So let's look now, take a little break here and look at some more recent developments, because despite the patterns that I've mentioned and I've elaborated on now so far, in the recent about 10 years, some supranational governance capacity has also emerged in the energy diplomacy domain. And the yeah, this policy episode is surely an example of a very gradual rather than a big bang integration here, but it's worth pointing out and looking a little bit because it generally reflects kind of the policy integration dynamics also in other policy fields of the European Union with two key elements. First, the Commission worked very strongly as a policy entrepreneur, and the second is that really deliberation and good arguments here mattered a lot in facilitating policy integration. So the origin of this chapter of policy integration in the energy diplomacy come once again from arguments related to the functioning of the internal energy market. For a long time, the Commission was worried about bilateral contracts between member states with third countries for the domestic or European security of supply and the functioning of the internal energy market. And then the security of supply regulation of 2010 for the first time required member states to communicate existing and new concluded intergovernmental agreements, IGAs, with third countries on gas infrastructure and supplies to the Commission. This was extended 2 years later with a decision that established a so-called information exchange mechanism on intergovernmental agreements, and it expanded these provisions to oil and electricity. So from then on, member states were obliged to share and the content of the intergovernmental agreements with the Commission. And how did the Commission argue here? It said there are problematic constellations when suppliers' commercial interests clash with EU energy market rules, and sometimes the threat of supply shortages could pressure some member states to accept regulatory concessions in their IGAs that are incompatible with the EU's energy acquis and would undermine the functioning of the internal energy market. So the Commission argued basically that it required this information to check if these intergovernmental agreements are in compliance with EU rules. And how would this be done? The Commission actually, in this information exchange mechanism, hoped for that it could have a look at these intergovernmental agreements before they are signed, so at draft versions, and that it could then kind of give a thumbs up or not if it deemed them compatible with EU law. But the majority of member states rejected that, again, concerns about sovereignty, etc. And this original information exchange mechanism was put in place that the Commission would only get the information about new intergovernmental agreements in the area of energy after they have been signed. And then a few policy episodes started that showed that this was kind of problematic, this setup. One was, for instance, South Stream, where 6 member states had signed intergovernmental agreements with Russia, which undermined core principles of the internal energy market. And the Commission wanted them to be renegotiated, but the member states could not really do that because there were no unilateral termination clauses. And only basically the whole situation only got resolved because when Russia basically withdrew from the project. And only this could in the end prevent a conflict of law on the one side between EU law and on the other side between international law, because these intergovernmental agreements are signed under international law. And there have been a few other examples, and I will point to literature if you are interested in this where you can later on where you can read about this in more detail. But these examples revealed the problems with the existing information exchange mechanism. If member states signed an IGA in the area of energy that was not conform with EU law, the Commission would, of course, eventually find out because it gets the information. And then it could start in principle an infringement procedure. However, this might be too late because the member state would already find itself trapped between different legal obligations. On the one side, EU law, and on the other hand, international law. And unless they would include unilateral termination clauses in these agreements, they could not simply renegotiate or terminate an IGA. So in essence, this shows that this kind of ex post compliance checks, the infringement procedures of the European Commission, were not sufficient. And this argumentation provided the Commission, after all, with quite strong new arguments for updating the legislation. And there was a revision of this information exchange mechanisms in 2017. Well, the legislative initiative was a little bit earlier, but it was signed in 2000, now finished and concluded in 2017. And where the Commission had a lot of policy entrepreneurship, and again with good arguments that with these arguments that I just mentioned, pushed forward for this. And the outcome of this revised information exchange mechanism involves supranational ex-ante control of new intergovernmental agreements. That means that the European Commission is now allowed to check the draft agreements of any new IGA. And it can then, if it does not deem it compatible with EU law, it can demand some changes. And only after this, the member states can or are allowed to conclude the IGAs. So this dramatically, or I mean, does increase in a way the Commission's authority in the energy diplomacy domain, because the Commission de facto for the first time has like some sort of veto power. No member states or a third country will sign an IGA that is at risk of being challenged at the court. So the Commission basically can say what it wants to be changed before any IGA is now signed. And also note that the Commission here really takes the function of what usually the court does. It does the legal interpretation of an IGA. So we see also some really strengthening of executive powers here, with a prerogative that usually lies with the judiciary. I mentioned some literature. If you want to read more about this, there have been two publications lately. One is from myself with a colleague in the Journal of European Public Policy, published in 2021, just now. And another publication is now online first by Francesca Bazzella in the Journal of Common Market Studies. And both of them basically review this development of the European Commission getting more powers in the energy diplomacy domain. Yeah, that's it from my side. I hope I could set the scene a little bit here from the governance and diplomacy perspective. And I look forward to later on to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Thank you also for the useful literature ideas. And I now pass the floor to Marco to present his case study.
Thank you very much, Ian, and thanks for inviting me to this excellent panel. I will try to share my screen now. All right, I hope you can see it. So what I would like to do in my 10 minutes is to give a quick overview of some of the main policy and scholarly debates of recent years in EU-Russia energy relations. And this is by no means exhaustive. It's just an appetizer, let's say. Let's see if I can move the slides. All right. So the topic has been studied from a number of disciplines and through various approaches. International political economy was certainly one of them. Various approaches in international relations theories have been applied, such as securitization theory, constructivist approaches, and more realist ones focusing on geopolitical aspects of the energy relationship. There are several aspects that these various approaches have in common. So one of them is the focus on actorness. So what kind of actors are Russia and the European Union in this relationship? And here I have some images of publications that were, in my opinion, important on this topic.
Marco, I'm sorry for interruption. There's an idea from the chat. If you can run the slideshow,
right? Okay.
It might not be as easily visible at smaller screens.
Okay. I hope
Perfect.
you can see it better now. Sorry.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
So as Philipp also mentioned, Andreas called the European Commission a liberal actor in a realist world. This was back in 2015. Perhaps the view has evolved a bit over time, if I remember his latest publications correctly. And so the question is whether following policy or new legislation or amendments, actually, such as the Gas Directive amendment, whether the European Union can still be seen mainly or simply as a liberal actor, or whether a more strategic approach has been adopted, especially in relations with partners such as Russia, energy partners such as Russia. And of course, the same question has been applied to Russia. Russia has been defined mostly as a geopolitical or a geoeconomic actor, but then there have been also studies such as Tatiana Romanova's work, which shows that, yes, this is true, but it's a bit more nuanced, and we have to look at the complexities of Russian decision-making and the variety also of Russian actors. Some scholars studied the role of ideas. So ideas, identities, and how they play the role in shaping actorness. And here I always recommend Caroline Kuzemko's excellent article from 2014 on this topic, which you see also in the presentation. There has also been a focus on power, and especially what kind of power the two actors have deployed in their energy relationship. So, for example, the main dichotomy, I would say, is between descriptions of the European Union deploying normative or regulatory power, whereas Russia mostly used geopolitical power. And this is perhaps one of the key dichotomies. And again, the question is whether this clear-cut dichotomy holds true, or if there is if there are nuances that should be explored. If we take the more extreme argument regarding Russia's geopolitical approach and use of geopolitical power, we have the so-called energy weapon argument, which I'm sure many of the participants will have already heard of. So the idea that Russia simply uses energy as a geopolitical instrument to pursue foreign policy goals. So this is a realist take, I would say. But on the other hand, there has been quite a broad consensus among scholars that the EU-Russia energy relationship is interdependent. And that a liberal approach is very helpful in understanding why this relationship works this way. And here you see two works that are particularly interesting on the topic of interdependence. Well, the one on the left, Per Oxelius' book Red Gas, published in 2014, is very interesting because it looks at how the relationship, how this interdependence originated. So with the first deals between Russia and between the Soviet Union, actually back then, and countries of the Western Bloc, West Germany, Italy, already in the late 1960s. And even before that, the first deal actually was with neutral Austria, even a bit earlier. The second book by Gustafsson, The Bridge, was published last year in 2020. And it's very interesting because it provides a reiteration of the argument that Paraxelius presents. So Paraxelius talked about gas trade as the hidden integration of Cold War Europe. And now Gustafsson talks about gas, so energy trade, as a bridge in a redivided Europe following the Ukraine crisis. At the same time, the debate about interdependence takes different shapes. For example, one of the questions that was asked is whether this interdependence is actually asymmetric and which side is more dependent on the other. And this, of course, has a lot of political ramifications depending on who is more dependent. Some have asked whether interdependence is indeed desirable, or whether either side is trying to get out of it. The European Union, by diversifying its providers, suppliers, through the energy union and so on, through additional imports of LNG or new projects such as the Southern Gas Corridor, and Russia, on the other hand, trying to increase its exports to Asia to become less dependent on the European market. In any case, I would say that for the last 15 years, security has been a core topic in European scholarly and policy debates on EU-Russia energy relations. And this is due to the growing geopolitical confrontation since the late 2000s. The Ukrainian gas transit crisis of 2006 and 2009 played an important role. Even though the situation has now changed in terms of pipelines and transport routes compared to 2009. And of course, the Ukraine crisis was also a key driver of the securitization of the debate. And now we see that often discussions about energy, discussion about new energy projects, of course, Nord Stream 2 being perhaps the most controversial one, they are tied to other policy developments that are unrelated to energy politics. I'm sure you've all heard about connections between Navalny's vicissitudes, Navalny's arrest, and what Europe should do about Nord Stream 2, for example. Nonetheless, energy trade has continued. Gas trade actually even increased following the Ukraine crisis, with new peaks in terms of volumes reached in 2018. Even though Russian-Ukrainian relations are obviously at a very low point, the two countries managed to conclude a new transit agreement in 2019, which is valid until 2024. So we see that despite the political tensions, this trade is continuing. At the same time, I would say that if we look at scholarly and policy debates, there are now some new developments. The agenda is somewhat evolving, and we already heard in the previous excellent presentations how this is happening. So the energy transition is now playing an important role in current debates. And this reflects developments on the ground, such as the announcement of the European Green Deal, or simply, or also greater public attention to climate change, which is becoming increasingly evident worldwide and also in the European Union and Russia. So some of the questions now are how long will the current fossil fuel-based EU-Russia energy relationship last? And what are the different, what's the different timing for the phase out of the sources, the energy sources that make up this relationship, with coal, of course, being that should be phased out earlier than oil and especially gas. And another question is whether the EU and Russia can cooperate in the energy transition by making their energy relationship more sustainable, shifting increasingly or progressively shifting to renewable energy or to and to hydrogen trades. So the European Green Deal is the main development on the EU's side, and this poses a challenge for the current framework of EU-Russia energy relations. On the one hand, it means decreasing consumption of fossil fuels in Europe, and Europe is the main export market for Russian fossil fuels. At the same time, the EU's plans include, as you heard, carbon border adjustment mechanism, and this will have an impact on Russia's exports. And especially on Russia's energy-intensive exports, metals, chemicals, fertilizers, for which again Europe is the main market. So, what is Russia's response to all this? Well, a debate is taking place in Russia. The main union of Russian industrialists and entrepreneurs is very critical, and would like to take the issue to the WTO. Of course, once the EU outlines its plans more clearly. But at the same time, there are also large companies such as Rusal, large aluminium exporter, which are arguing for a more flexible approach by Russia and for the adoption of greener policies, of a carbon market in Russia. And also at the political level, this is, for example, the view of the presidential advisor on climate change, which argues that Russia should look at different responses and not simply challenge at the WTO. Also, while the elites do not yet have a clear focus on climate change policies in Russia, or do not have it at all actually at the moment, there is increasing pressure from civil society because climate change is visible, it's quite visible also in Russia, with melting permafrost in the north, which is also a massive infrastructural challenge, to vast forest fires in Siberia, which we have seen, for example, in the summer of 2019. I would like to conclude by actually agreeing with what Andreas said and applying it a little bit to the case of EU-Russia relations. The Green Deal can only work if Europe has other countries on board, and Russia is definitely one of the key countries as the fourth largest emitter globally, and also as a country that has developed a specialization in energy production and energy intensive exports, mostly to service the European market. So in a way, Europe and Russia are very much tied, and they should be tied also in the energy transition. A lot of the emissions that Russia causes are linked to production for exports, and the European market is the main market for these exports. So I will just conclude by pointing to two publications for more specific policy developments, and especially the one on the left is a publication in a handbook that Michèle has edited, and you find a lot more details there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco, very much. And I take your last sentence as a nice bridge to connect to Michèle, who is our final speaker in this panel.
Yeah, just had to wait until the screen was unshared. Thank you very much. This handbook is edited by me and your Knodt, and a lot of people here in the room, in the digital room, are part of that book. So that's nice to see things coming together. I will do a very brief presentation because I think everybody is getting tired and I'm rushing through it. I already took the slides out as time went by. I'm presenting on, maybe go back, perceptions on the EU external energy governance. And I mean, the bridge was also perfect because Marco took up what Andreas said. The Green Deal can only went okay if the EU has other countries on board. And that was also the message of Piga Barks in the morning. And I think, funny enough, that's really fitting well with the presentation now, because if we want to have partnership and if we want to have a good European diplomacy, we have to look at mutual perceptions, how they are interacting, the EU with other partners, and how do they see each other. And this is what I will talk about. The data is from different sources. We did a media analysis in German, UK, and France media outlets. In addition, Brazilian, Indian, South African, China, Russia, but Russia will not be included here because it's overlapping. And we did elite interviews, a big survey in these 4 big countries, and a network analysis also of the bilateral. If I say BICS, I always refer to the bilateral communication and interaction. First of all, the quality of these bilateral dialogues, it's very bad. It's not working good. EU actors are marginalized. I just show you one of the networks. So that's the network of Brazilian Energy Corporation, but you can do it with each of them. And most of the times you see very nicely in the middle, the whatever respective countries is, Brazil, India, and so on. And you see the EU partners also always marginalized. So that's not working. In addition, the partners do not devote sufficient commitment to the dialogue. That was before the Green Deal. And that was also before the mechanism Philipp talked about was really working. We have an institutional fragmentation. A lot of European actors speak with different voices. So it's a polyphony of voices. The EU and member states on parallel tracks, and a lack of knowledge on the EU member states energy cooperation, which is now a little bit better, but still, when it's beyond the agreements, the EU Commission doesn't know very much about what member states are doing there. So now let's see, the dialogue is not working. Why is it not working? And we think that the interaction is not working because the perceptions are so different and the communication is so bad. If you look at media, how do we see these big countries when it comes to energy, and how do they see us? When we look at these countries, it's only China, China, China. And when they look at us, only China really reports about us. The others are nearly not reporting about the EU. When you look at the elite within the dialogue, everybody says, I mean, over 90% said, yeah, that's very important. So that's not a match between the overall media look at the EU and the elites' view of it. When we look more in what they are talking about when they talk about energy issues, we see that especially Germany most of the time looks at investment. French media is looking more at emissions, but the big countries, they are looking at investment emissions, but also, especially in India and South Africa, at energy access and sustainable development, while the EU media is only looking at investment or emissions. You can see it even more when we look at the elites within the dialogue. So we ask the people who are in these bilateral dialogues, and what do you want to, what is the most important when cooperating? And the EU public actors always said climate change, climate change, climate change. And as a second issue, private sector cooperation. While the big actors, public actors, they are talking about cooperation, technology transfer. So they're not talking about the same thing, or they don't want to talk about the same thing. The same when we look at the normative energy frame, you know, this triangle, you talk about norms, energy norms, competitiveness, sustainability, or security of supply. So while when big countries, medias report about the EU, they only report about the sustainability frame. But when the European media is reporting, there's a lot of the competitiveness frame, which fits the investment focus, and also security of supply. And then when we look at the elite, this is very important in the dialogue. They don't talk about the same, or they don't have the same normative priorities. Like when we look at the China-EU dialogue, China wants to talk about security of supply, Europe wants to talk about sustainability in first place. When we look at Brazil, the same picture. When we look in India, India is a bit difficult because there was not a lot of reply to our survey, so it's not very stable, these outcomes, but at least they want to look a bit more at sustainability and competitiveness, and the EU at sustainability, and only in the last part, it really matches both, really want to look at security of supply. And then how do they see each other within the dialogue? This is, I love that one, because they look so different. If we only look at one of the things we were asking, do they have an open agenda or do they have a hidden agenda, would be the negative form of it. And if you ask, what is the view of the big actors in these dialogues, the big perception is, yes, they are very open, they have an open agenda, everybody knows, can see that, it's here. But the EU perception is, no, they are working with a hidden agenda. There's something, we cannot trust them. And if you look at vice versa, what do people respond when you ask them about the EU's properties? Is the EU working with an open agenda? The EU perception was, yes, for sure, they have an open agenda. And the big perception is, no, they have a hidden agenda. Don't trust them, you know? So that's difficult. Lacking trust in this kind of communication is difficult. So the elite in media discourse shows different perception on issues, on frames, on roles in most cases. And if perception and image of an actor and its policy influencing how policymakers define a certain situation, how they interpret it, and how do they act to it, how do this shape their preferences, then different perceptions again are difficult. So there's a mismatch, and that can explain in part, at least, the poor performance in the bilateral energy dialogues. The EU is very bad in speaking with their counterparts. It's better to speak to them. And if we have a look again and what Andreas was presenting, with whom we should have better partnerships, if we speak only at them, that's really a difficult match. So that is what our research provides us as a starting point. Thank you very much. That's it already.
Thank you so much, Michèle. We have maybe 15 minutes left. I would like to open discussion. If there are any questions, please turn on your mic and ask directly, or write them in the chat if you cannot talk directly, and I will pass it to the speakers. Is there anybody who would like to open the floor? If not, until you write your questions or think about it, I would like to ask Andreas and possibly also the other speakers, because it seems to me that the recurring theme of this panel was the need to entangle more with the important third parties in our decarbonization efforts. And Andreas has highlighted that very clearly. So Andreas, what would be the next steps? I mean, we know where to look at, we know essentially what the goals should be, and how can we achieve them? What will be your policy recommendations on that?
Yeah, well, thank you. I guess the policy recommendation would be do it. I mean, we have it all laid out, really. I mean, for the sake of the argument, you know, of all the low carbon investment that we're seeing each year, you know, 2/3 roughly go into the non-OECD world, which is great. But if you unpack the non-OECD world, it essentially goes to 3 places. That's China primarily, then a little bit to India, and a little bit to China, to Brazil. And the rest of it, well, what's left is essentially 11, 12, 13%. And that goes, you know, we're recorded, right? So anyone can fact check this, but that goes to, that means essentially, we're talking about 2.5 billion people, maybe a little bit more. They get about 12, 13% of the investment. So we know what the problem is. The next step would be to facilitate partnerships and mechanisms that allow investments to go to those places that are smaller economies with a lower demand pool because they're less rich, more poor than we are, which also don't necessarily have the legal and governance environment that's needed to pull off these investments. And that means a strong role for external actors, including the EU and our financing institutions for de-risking that investment, for making sure there is a good package that allows that investment to happen, for making sure, you know, you get the PPPs in place that might support these things. We have the instruments. We have major agencies, development agencies, technical cooperation agencies. We have major public banks. We can pull this off. We've got to do this. The one problem is, and maybe I close here, the one problem is that we don't maybe that's the second recommendation, let's not get, we haven't gotten our institutions into the right place. And just for the sake of the argument, the organization at EU level dealing with the border carbon adjustment mechanism, which is a major piece, as I think, of the external dimension of the EU deal. Where does it sit? It sits in the tax and customs unit. But you can say a lot of good things probably about the tax and customs unit, but they're not very strategic when it comes to diplomacy, external dimensions, all these kind of things. Essentially, what you could do is you get a mainstream energy and climate diplomacy and sustainability into the EU institutional body, so that all these scattered competences essentially are streamlined behind that one goal. And I think that's something that the EU urgently needs to do, because whatever the tax and customs unit does, it certainly has external implications and might well fall on our feet if we don't take care of it. So I guess this is what I would say we need to do urgently. And there's a zillion other things, but I guess we need another panel for this.
Thank you. There's one question by Sanya and also Arina. So I will start with Sanya because it follows up a bit. Directed to Michèle and Philipp, what can we do to strengthen the sort of one voice aim that we have long had in the EU, but you know it is extremely difficult to come by with. What would be your take on that?
Michèle, do you want to start, or?
I would say you would not immediately have to make it one voice, but you have to use the polyphony and you have to speak to each other. The problem is that they don't communicate among each other. That goes in line a little bit with Andreas' last point. I mean, if you make it a mainstreaming, they should really sit together in this before these dialogues and really think about what in which way they are communicating. Then it's not important who is communicating it, but what do we really want and how could we streamline our arguments and our strategies? Because what happened in the dialogue was that DG Energy was talking about this and the others were talking about other things, and it didn't come together. and then polyphony is a problem. If it's more streamlined, or if it's better internally communicated and revised, then I think polyphony is not a problem.
Yeah, I totally agree, Michèle, and maybe a few other thoughts on this. Now, in an ideal world, we would have a lot of time, and this would all be a generic development. We can already see that some of the interests, as the decarbonization moves on and more countries move towards electricity, as the electrification of the many sectors moves on in Europe, interests kind of start to converge more. One reason is that slowly but steadily energy mixes start to assimilate, and that also creates changes in the underlying in the interests. Then, of course, this goes only very slowly and step by step. And in the long term, certainly, I think if the electrification moves on, interests will be quite similar, simply for the reason that electricity security is a cross-border issue. It's not a national issue. We already see that to some degree, gas security or oil security is a cross-border issue, but much less than in terms of electricity. So some technical arguments matter here very much. With regard to electricity, it's then also a question if we integrate cross-border with third countries. Because electricity integration requires a lot more technical cooperation and regulation than in oil and gas. So we will see whether this can work. Now we've been talking a little bit about hydrogen, and actually it's interesting because it attracts a lot of attention, even though I think hydrogen is much more looking in the future than currently. What about we should probably also look more into electricity, international electricity relations, which is a much more current issue, I think so. And with regard to hydrogen, I see a little bit the problem that currently we see that different countries already have start their own hydrogen strategies, and start something that we haven't discussed about so far, I think at least, is something that's sometimes been labeled hydrogen diplomacy. And there is, I think, maybe the others disagree, but there might be a risk that we have a repetition of some current patterns, that some countries, some EU member states do engage now in hydrogen diplomacy, try to get their shares of the market or whatever, and their relationships, and that this might result again in divergent interests, in some competition maybe between EU members, and in trying to defend one's own interests again. Otherwise, I would see that there's some potential for a common approach, but I'm a little bit worried with these individualistic hydrogen strategies. But we have some other experts here. Maybe you have different views on that.
Yeah, maybe moving to Marco and combining that with the first question. If there's a Russia-EU hydrogen cooperation, what it would be like? What's your take on that? It's a very forward-looking question, but do you have a hunch what this might look like?
Well, it's quite a difficult question. We know that there is some infrastructure in place that can be converted for that purpose. I think it would be a way of keeping some of the ties that are in place, and that, while we know that these ties have not prevented political crisis, we can also say that perhaps they prevented their escalation in a way. So I can imagine that there can be both economic and political benefits. But I mean, this relates to your previous question also, what to do to bring third parties into the Green Deal. And Russia is definitely one of them. I think that there is plenty of room, or there is more room in Russia, or in general in most of the eastern and southern neighborhoods, to implement climate action, because less was done so far. So when it comes to reducing emissions, strengthening energy efficiency, boosting renewable energy production. So one key challenge would be to make sure that investments, also European investments, go where they can achieve greater results in terms of the common goal of tackling climate change. So how to do this? Creating, facilitating legislation, common markets that allow these flows of money to go to these areas. So this would be very generally the key challenge, in my opinion. And again, there will be political benefits, or to see it in a different way, we could also avoid security crisis, because let's think about what we were saying before, what Andreas was saying about the social contract in North Africa, in Algeria, for example. If that breaks down, and if a country like Algeria loses its main source of revenues, what will happen to its youth? We have already seen how the refugee crisis, or the refugee reception crisis in Europe, was an extremely hot political potato. So shifting from the traditional fossil fuel-based relationship to a more sustainable relationship will also provide not just economic benefits, but also political perspective for those countries and for people who live there.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe a very quick follow-up question. Michèle has introduced the perspective of the third parties of EU external energy policy, or the counterparts, and you talk a bit about Russia as well, about Russian perceptions of the Green Deal, and I wanted to ask about the wider sort of context of that. How the Russians, given their investment, I mean, social, economic, and like all that investment in oil and gas, how do they make sense of energy transition that might be taking place in Europe right now? How do they interpret that, and what does it mean for their perception of their sort of oil and gas ambitions, identity, and all that?
Yeah, so in one of my slides, I refer to a recent briefing paper that I co-authored with my colleague Jussi Lassila on this. Well, it really depends whom you ask. Of course, the vested interests in the hydrocarbon economy, which are very strong, see this as a major concern, even though perhaps not as an immediate one. These groups argue that CBAM, so the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is green protectionism, and that Russia should challenge it at the World Trade Organization. At the same time, many understand that that there is a clear trend, not just in Europe, but globally. We saw that last summer, South Korea, Japan, announced climate neutrality goal for the year 2050. China also, if I remember correctly, for 2060. So there is pressure to adapt. And domestically in Russia, there has been a tradition of protests concerning environmental questions. And now these are becoming more tied to global climate change demonstrations. So as I said before, some companies like Rusal, but also, Rosatom, they have been thinking about the energy transition and also making investments. And of course, by the way, in Russia, the nuclear sector, which has been revived progressively since 2006, is also seen, as in some European countries, by the way, as part of, as one of the ways of decreasing emissions. Maybe just, I'm taking too much time, but one final point. Russia is also formulating low carbon strategies. However, because of the economic collapse of the 1990s and the related decrease in emissions, and also the phase out of the Soviet time industry, it doesn't need to do too much to meet the goals of the, to fulfill the agenda, let's say, of the Paris Agreement for the year 2030. So again, some more policy stimuli would be necessary. And we see some policy entrepreneurs that are focusing on this. But of course, the resistance in society is huge. And maybe Europe should talk more to those who are investing in the transition in Russia.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll see about the efforts in the transportation sector. There are last two reactions from Philipp and Andreas.
Yeah, I have a short point also to make to this question. Of course, from the Swiss perspective, you see behind me, that's the University of St. Gallen. So that's how it looks. Where here in Switzerland, all a little bit more, more rural. But the point I want to make is that EU third country relations in energy, there I have the feeling there is sometimes really an important point here to raise, in the sense that the EU needs to be become also a little bit clearer about how it's prioritizes different objectives it has in relations with third countries. And what do I mean by that? We see in EU-Switzerland energy relations currently that the EU is adopting very much an approach where it wishes the third country not to cherry pick. And it has been doing so for good reasons, maybe. And it's a similar approach, for instance, to EU-UK relations now in the Brexit negotiations. What do I mean by this? There seems to be an increasingly tougher approach in terms of regulation, in terms of we work together, we define also the regulations in our approach. But at the same time, the European Green Deal, at least it seems to tell us, like there is a huge new policy objectives related to energy in the EU, and that's the sustainability approach. And I am sometimes not entirely sure yet how the EU prioritizes these objectives, where they conflict. And I can give you a practical example in terms of sustainability. Switzerland and the EU have absolutely, and also the UK and the EU have absolutely the same objectives. But because of this regulatory approach, they don't work as much together as they could in achieving these objectives. And it would probably create synergies on both sides in achieving the sustainability objectives. So I'm sometimes wondering whether this kind of more stronger regulatory approach to EU third country in relations in the energy sector is not to a certain degree undermining maybe some the potential to achieve sustainability objectives. And that's something that if the EU means it's serious with the Green Deal and with its external approach to that, has to potentially to reconsider a little bit.
Thank you, Philipp. Andreas?
Yeah, maybe a final one. We're over time, so I cut it short. I can absolutely agree here. I guess my point is, it not only matters what you want, but also how you get there. And if you're the EU, you're a regulatory state, and that means, if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. Whatever you encounter, you throw the regulatory state apparatus at it, and you hope that solves the problem. But others do differently. And I think one of the things that we really need to watch is how the US and particularly Asian economies approach the problem. John Kerry just the other day has said, look, for us, CBAM, carbon tax at the border, these kind of measures, they're simply a non-starter. We don't like that. That's essentially what he said. And mind you, this is a US administration that has put climate and climate security at the forefront of their policies. We share the same goals. So we may well end up being in our crosshairs over how to get there, simply because the EU is not very flexible when it comes to their toolbox. And a final point maybe, and that's why I love the study that Michèle presented so much. I mean, perceptions really matter. The other day, the Adenauer Foundation and their Hong Kong office just released a really interesting study on perceptions of a CBAM in East Asia. And the long and the short of it is they all say, look, this is green protectionism, full stop, period. It's not only Russia saying this. I mean, whatever you think about Russia, I don't know, they think they're going to be the last man standing. I don't think they're going to be the last man standing in a fossil economy. But it's not only them. Essentially, the rest of the world looks at us and goes like, hold on, what are you guys doing here? You know, you promote your green industrial revolution and you go happily green, and what do? This is green protectionism. So I guess we're at a crossroads here, and probably we better get our acts together when it comes to getting this right, because again, wanting the same thing is not identical to getting there at the same time. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So thank you for the nice wrap up of the panel. We will be meeting again at 2 with Katja Biedenkop, so don't forget to tune in, and I wish you nice lunch, whatever you are doing during the break.
Thanks a lot for my side too. I'm changing my role now. Thanks a lot, all the panelists. Thanks a lot. That was fantastic.